Hello everyone, welcome back to On the Fly. Today we're doing another video where we take a look at how to draft in a fantasy hockey league. So obviously one of the most important parts of any sort of fantasy league, whether that be baseball, hockey, football, basketball, or otherwise, is basically drafting your team. Obviously, this is a big part. You're going to be stuck with most of these players, and you'll also be trading these players away. So it is an important step, and I'll sort of walk you through what to do, what not to do when it comes to the hockey aspect of it. So we'll start off with number one, the scoring system. So the most important part of any sort of league is knowing your scoring system. So if it's a high, if you get a lot of points, or it's a categorical league where most of the sort of categories land under scoring goals, you're not going to pick a player that is defensively minded and sort of plays that defensive role, not really on the power play. So it's really important to know what your scoring systems are, whether that's categorical, of course, or the point scoring. So definitely one to be paying attention to. And really, you want to pick players that fit under that category. So if it's a goal scorer, obviously the main players you're looking for is sort of like a Matthews and McDavid. But if say it's more defensive, you might pick a player like a Scheifele, where he's not going to be contributing as much on the offensive side, but he's still sort of taking care of it. And there's also some of those more grinder type leagues where it's more sort of hits and fights and penalty minutes. So you might look at a player like a Tom Wilson, like a Ryan Reeves, where they'll sort of maximize you out on those penalty minutes, on those fights. So really important to kind of understand what your scoring system is, especially when it comes to your draft, because obviously you're picking players that fit under those types of leagues. So once again, know your scoring system. The second one to take much note of is the the risk of picking under ADP and draft ranking. So ADP, also known as average draft position. This is one where I do find a lot of people sort of struggle, especially with newcomers to fantasy hockey, mainly because obviously if you're picking off of a computer-generated list, the computer doesn't always know, and they don't really have insider information. One example of this, which I'll kind of go under later, is a player like Tyler Toffoli. He's currently ranked at about 1,249. And obviously that is another sort of steal, but I'll get more towards him later on down below. But it is important to know sort of what players you're looking for, whether that be, so Makar, for example, he's ranked pretty low, pretty high. He's ranked at about 32 for his ADP and draft ranking, but the truth is he should be going way higher. And if you look at a player like a John Carlson, for example, I think he's ranked at about 6. And he has no place being there. So it is important to know sort of where some of these players are falling, and not necessarily not taking them at their draft position, but being relatively wary of sort of what's happening there. Because if I were to draft, I wouldn't be picking a guy like John Carlson over a player like Makar, because obviously Makar, he's sort of getting all the roles, and especially in scoring leagues, you want guys to play power play minutes. So I much prefer a player like Makar, who has that potential upside, as opposed to a player like Carlson, who's sort of flatlining right now. Obviously, he's a good player. I'm not saying that he's not, but definitely someone to be looking for, especially in the later rounds. If you can pick up Makar in the second round, third round of your draft, definitely a steal. But that will bring me to point number 3, and this is for goalies. So I've already made a video on the goalies. Link can be found in the description below. But the truth with hockey and fantasy, especially with goalies, is that your goalie is your team. So if you're picking, say, a goalie, you're not necessarily picking the goalie, although there is a few sort of ideas behind goalies. I went more deep into the video, but mainly goalies are their team. So Vasilevsky's the Tampa Bay Lightning. Obviously, they win a lot. Kemper now is the Colorado. And really, all these goalies sort of fall under the category. And really, you don't pick the goalie for the goalie. You pick the goalie for the team. So obviously, the one issue that I sort of come across here is drafting goalies with backups. And most people don't really have are unable to understand that when you draft a goalie that has a backup, he's playing half the time, and you do need a goalie that plays the majority of games, if not all, but the majority of them, which is why I sort of look towards goalies with minimal backups and really non-NHL caliber backups. Well, of course, Colorado is one of the goalies which I recommended in my 3 players that will win your fantasy league. And I think Kemper for sure is a good pick, mainly because Francois isn't really going to be a backup for Colorado. He isn't going to be playing a lot. But he does have, especially Kemper has the upside to play with Colorado behind a really solid D-core. So I do recommend, if you haven't already, watch the end of this video and then head over to my goalie video and I'll get more in depth onto that. But we'll move on to the 4th, and that's sort of backing up the point of the 3rd, which is drafting goalies too high is definitely something to be avoiding. So goalies, unless you're going to be going after a high goalie, which I don't really recommend, a goalie like Vasilevsky, Hellebuck, you don't want to draft a goalie super high. My belief is goalies should be drafted either 4th round or 5th round, get 2 solid forwards and then a defense, or a really solid forward and then 2 defense. But I mean, if you are going to be drafting a goalie and a high goalie, be willing to trade him. He will have a lot of value, and then you can kind of trade back sort of your guy. But for me, and if I was you, I would never draft a goalie within the top 3. And if you are, make sure it's well worth it. And I mean, there's obviously an exception. Say Vasilevsky falls to the 2nd round, the 3rd round. Yes, you pick him up, but most of the time he'll go. Somebody will bite it. Somebody won't be watching this video, and I do highly encourage you to watch this video again and again so you don't make these mistakes. But you don't want to try and draft goalies high because there's better players in the rounds. And goalies are sort of like quarterbacks if you ever play fantasy football, where you'll get a solid quarterback even in the 7th, 8th round. You're not really pressed to get a goalie. So really you want to try and avoid taking goalies. Pick your best players nice and early. Get your forwards, get your defense, and then sort of worry about goalie as sort of a last resort. But moving on to number 5, and that is my rule of a 1st round forward. So with the 1st round forwards, you get a pick within, I'd argue, the top 10. You're going to go with a forward, mainly because you got a whole bunch of really good forwards, and I never would suggest picking a goalie. I don't ever want you taking Vasilevsky. I would argue, of course, that you could, if you get sort of that 10th, 11th, 12th sort of pick, maybe you think about a defenseman like a Carlson or a Makar, but I definitely don't recommend forcing it. I do generally like taking a forward, whether that's McDavid, Draisaitl, Kucherov, Rantanen, Marchand, Pastrnak. You have all these sort of guys in that 1st round where you can pick them, they'll be solid for you, and they'll play every night, which is really the kicker for most of these guys is for goalies, they don't play every night, so you're not maximizing your point potential, but it is important, once again, to get a goalie. And also sort of knowing whether it's a weekly lock league or a daily lock. If it's a daily lock, I don't suggest taking a goalie at all early, mainly because it's just a filled roster spot and he's not going to play every game. But I do suggest taking one of those high forwards, especially early on. Which brings me on to my point number 6, and this is really one of the most important points. I would argue that this is either 1 or 2 on this list, and that is know your competition. So if you're facing a league with a bunch of people that are picking off the ADP draft position, it is easier to take advantage of them, obviously. You can sort of pick Makar, because Makar, I believe, is ranked something like 26 or 34 or relatively high. You can get him a little bit later on in your draft. But if you are playing people that all know about hockey, you do need to really start to consider what they're going to do and sort of think a few moves ahead of them, know your competition, and also sort of know what their strategies are. I'll talk a little bit later on about what these strategies are for your team. But mainly you want to look at strategy with the other team, because sometimes you can sort of jump them and then trade with them a little bit later on. Obviously, there's some guys that people want, whether there's bias with their favorite team. You can trade with some guys and really sort of take more than you really took out of the draft, whether that's a higher pick. So say you trade a Penguins fan's favorite player is Jake Gensel or Sidney Crosby. You get Sidney Crosby a little bit later. You steal him before your opponent does, and then you trade him to try and trade up. So say you get a player like a Rantanen, like a Rantanen, or someone that's pretty solid, then it really shouldn't have been. That sort of got picked before, say Gensel did, or Crosby. But overall, it is important to sort of take note of what your opponents are doing and sort of evaluate your competition beforehand. Most people do know when they're getting into the league sort of how strong their competitors are, and you can sort of take note of it as soon as sort of the first picks go, whether or not they're just sort of auto picking, and you'll see the list sort of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and if all 7 of them go sort of in order, that should raise a red flag for you. But you can sometimes take advantage of your competition, especially if they don't really know what they're doing. And other people, you can just laugh at them as you take Makar at 44 because they didn't realize that he is probably one of the best defensemen you will get, and is really a really good player for the bang for buck value. Moving on to point number 7, and that is strong defense. So for me, my belief is 2 forwards in the first 2 rounds, and then maybe you consider a 3rd round forward again. But I also want to say that if you can get a player like Makar late, you get Makar. You can get a bunch of really solid defense, especially in the middle rounds. So I know for me, I've done a few drafts recently where I take my first three or so rounds of forwards. I take the next 3 rounds of, say, defense, and then basically 7th, 8th round, I take a goalie. But my sort of idea is that you take the best defenseman you can find and sort of just capitalize on it, mainly because a lot of the defense are hidden, especially in the ADP and the draft ranks. Knowing where my competition is, I take advantage of that, and I sort of draft all my favorite, at least for the fantasy-wise, defensemen, and I do find that I can pick out Makar pretty often and pick him up. So it is important to grab strong defense because obviously it is a little bit difficult to find defense in these games, especially later rounds. Because if you don't pick defense early, you're going to be stuck with a pretty lousy defense core, and that's another problem that you tend to find with most of your opponents is that they will often trade you defensemen for forwards. So if you can, take the defense all day, especially if it's a good quality defenseman, absolutely take the deal. But I'll probably come out with a trading video sometime in the near future, which will kind of highlight how to make trades, how to sort of avoid locking yourself up in the future. But that will be for another day. And moving on to point 8, and that is focus projections. So with most people, at least, that I've learned is that they look at projections and these ESPN and these Yahoo projections that really don't make sense for these players. And there's also players, of course, that aren't projected as well as they probably should be. So there's sort of a balance between it. You take a sort of a look at the 2020 stats, 2019 stats, and you sort of compare them to the 2021, 2022 stats. And you can kind of see a pretty big jump in terms of what they're predicting and what they're not, and you can kind of analyze it. I mean, don't be dumb here and sort of look at it and see McDavid's going to put up 100 goals rather, and think it's right. Obviously, he's not going to put up 100 goals, but I mean, if they have him listed at say 50 goals and like a whole bunch of assists, I mean, maybe you agree with it. And then you sort of can do it with other players, especially down the line, because there's a lot of guys in your league that will look at it and especially say, oh, that's a good idea. I'll take some random guy that you probably never heard of and probably plays 4th line, where the ESPN says that he's going to put up 45 goals this year, outscoring Matthews. So for me, I don't necessarily look at the projections, and I don't recommend you do either. I say take it with a grain of salt for anything you do. Obviously, they're not wizards, they can't predict the future, but you can probably predict the future better than they can. So know your stuff before you go into the draft, and really just dominating your draft, because most people will just look at the projections, rankings, ADP. So really just dominate there. No one's gonna really compete with you, but just really know your stuff, and you're probably gonna win your league right out of the draft. And then from there on out, just keep doing what you're doing. And if you get a really good trade, you're stealing from somebody, absolutely take it. Moving on to point 9, and this sort of brings me back to an earlier point with Tyler Toffoli. So with Toffoli, I've had him twice. I've had 2 drafts. I've got him twice in the last round, just because no one knows where he is. He's hidden in drafts. He's sort of a wild card because he has 0 projected stats, so no one can find him. And he's currently ranked about, I think, 1,248 was his latest ranking. So if you do search his name in the middle of your draft, I do suggest doing it right away, queuing him up so you don't forget about him. And really, he will be pretty much a steal your fantasy winner. I didn't want to put in the last video because I actually had no idea. I found it out pretty recently when I went looking for him. But he is a really late round draft choice, and I do suggest you taking him, especially in the late round, because he is one of those players where everybody's going to sleep on him. Nobody knows what's up with him up until first game, when he scores a whole bunch of goals, a whole bunch of assists, plays a great game, and has a massive plus-minus boost. I do suggest picking him up in any league, any type of scoring format, and he'll really be a solid player for you. But bringing us to number 10, the final point, and that's going to be have a strategy. So there are multiple strategies you can incorporate into your draft. Obviously, there are your point strategies. You want to sort of draft your best team possible. There's other strategies where you take the players with the highest trade value and go for a trade spree. So if you are going to go for a trade spree, make sure the people in your league are willing to trade beforehand. So don't necessarily go into a league and basically take the trade lists and without knowing that your competition is going to trade with you. Because if you go in guns a-blazing and you don't have anything to trade with, you are going to be in trouble. But if you aren't, I suggest mainly just going with the best draft strategy. There are certain times where you can go full trade bait. There's other strategies where you go full goalies. I don't suggest going full goalies, but there are some strategies where you do that. But I do suggest if you follow the list, you draft your early forwards, you draft your early defensemen, you take your goalie a little bit later. You will definitely start off the gate better than most teams in your league, and you'll really just dominate from there. Absolutely no doubt about it. But if you made it this far in the video, thanks for watching. If you liked it, drop a like. If you really liked it, consider subscribing. Tell all your friends, leave a comment down below what you want to see next in fantasy hockey. Until next time, see ya.